Hi, everybody. It's Matt. And before we get started with the episode, just wanted to do a quick shout out and a plug for a friend of the pod who's also been a guest on one of our episodes. Our friend Paul Janice, who you may remember as being a guest on our episode of Dracula from the Vampire series. He has written a play called The Tragical History of Dracula, and it is going to be live streamed as a table read on Halloween. I, for one, can say I've read the play and it's really excellent, and it's really definitely something that I'm going to be watching, and we hope that you'll be interested in it too. It's going to be done through a GoFundMe, would be how you get the tickets. Um, Now, keep in mind that Paul is in England right now, so all of the donation tiers are going to be in pounds, but a ticket for the live stream world premiere on Halloween is going to be £5. £20 will get a ticket and a paperback copy of the play. £50 will have all of the above plus a tote bag. £75 will have all of that plus a Dracula t-shirt. And if you're willing to give £300, you'll get all of that plus a very limited edition hand-bound hardcover copy of the play. So if this is something that you're interested in, and I hope that some of you are, it's going to be done through a GoFundMe, and so you can go to gofundme.com/f/livestream Dracula, or you can just go to the main GoFundMe page and search for Livestream Dracula. It's the Huddersfield result. So that's really all I have to say about that, but we definitely hope that you will check it out. Thanks, and here's the episode. There's 45 million pounds of chicken shit dumped into the bay each year. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa, and this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 2 of season 5. Last week, we discussed eco horror and speculated about why the wilderness is a place of terror. This week, we're continuing our discussion of the dangers in nature, specifically from the creatures that might reside there. All right, so this podcast comes out every 2 weeks. And for those of you listeners who don't know, in our off weeks that we don't have main episodes, we have other episodes that come out for our Patreon supporters. So for our Patreon supporters, they get to hear us kind of go more in depth into the topic. And we decided, since we were talking about nature attacking, we would have to at some point talk about the movie Evil Dead. I'm a big fan of it. I know Matt is a big fan of it. So we talked a little bit about the history of Evil Dead and the making of the movie in specific on that mini episode. We talked a little bit about the potential haunting of the cabin, like the real life cabin that they filmed it in. But then a very exciting thing happened, and I'm really ridiculously excited to talk about this because, listeners, this is truly momentous. Mel had actually never seen the first Evil Dead all the way through. Like, she's seen Army of Darkness, and she knows, I think, a lot about the Evil Dead movie because Matt and I have talked about it a lot, and she's seen key scenes in it, so she knew what she was getting into. But then, and I will admit, when I suggested we do this series of nature attacking, and I knew we were going to talk about Evil Dead, it was a little bit sinister of me because I knew I wanted to like force her a little bit to watch this. And I got my way. So Mel, you finally watched Evil Dead, and now we're totally going to put you on the spot because Matt and I demand to know what you thought about it.
Wow. Um, I have to say, I imagine my reaction watching it now in my 40s versus if I had watched it all the way through when I was a kid instead of just seeing bits and pieces of it would probably be different. And I'd be interested in knowing what I would have thought. Though, I am a wimp when it comes to horror movies. So if I had seen the whole movie when I was younger, I probably would have uh, uh, been pretty scared of certain parts of it. Um, Bruce Campbell's in it, which is pretty amazing. So I enjoyed that. And I felt like I kind of knew what was going to happen already because I just heard so much about it. And like you said, I'd seen some of the key scenes of the reading from the book and parts of the scenes in the cellar and the tree scene. Um, I was really interested in seeing the special effects at the end because I had read about them and how long it took to film them and that they were done with claymation. I thought that was really interesting to see. And I totally see how it fits perfectly in with this theme that we're talking about with some innocent people going out into the woods and probably biting off a little bit more than they could chew. Let me see what else. I enjoyed this time watching it all the way through and looking at the house and knowing the backstory of the house that we talked about in the mini episode about how it was actually haunted. I thought that was kind of cool because if I'd watched it before, I wouldn't have known that. So I felt like that added a little extra oomph to it since I'm a haunted house fan. Um, yeah, I don't know. I like the incorporation of the Book of the Dead. Um, I'm not a big like zombie movie fan, so I wouldn't have been drawn to it, I suppose, but I thought it was cool, the idea of the demon possession. And it plays with, yeah, I mean, all the tropes and themes that you think of with like young people going out in the woods to have fun and ending up getting in over their head with something possibly evil. And like I said at the beginning, it was cool to see Bruce Campbell doing his Bruce Campbell thing and being so young. It was, and I think that's the other thing that was kind of cool about too, is you're looking at a bunch of people who are like, in college and making this film. And so it was kind of neat to see some of the camera angles and the camera work and stuff like that.
But what you're really saying here is that you loved it and are going to be watching it again this weekend. That's what I'm hearing.
I don't know if I'll watch it again this weekend, but I'm sure I'll probably watch it again in the future, like possibly during another Halloween season.
Okay, that's acceptable
Is that
as well.
okay? Is that acceptable? Okay.
That is acceptable. Well, I'm glad you finally got around to watching it. It's well, I love all the Evil Dead movies. They're all very special in their own way. Um, so yeah, I'm glad you finally did watch it.
Yeah, I have to say I am too. And I'm always surprised and I'm curious to know, having seen Army of Darkness, did anything surprise you about the first one? Like knowing what it kind of ended up as? Because I usually find that people, I don't know, I think people are maybe a little bit surprised about the tone of the movie.
Oh, that Army of Darkness is so much more comically toned.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Army of Darkness is just funny, fun and funny to watch. Evil Dead, the tone was a little darker, I guess, than I expected because of that, because it was in the series. But I'd known from talking to people that it had a slightly darker tone than Army of Darkness. I think parts of it were probably meant to be played kind of tongue in cheek. Um, but I didn't necessarily see it that way. Like the tree scene still creeps me out, even though I'm seeing it for a second or third time as an older person. And I don't, it's been a while since I saw Army of Darkness, but I just remember thinking that was kind of a fun romp and not really being that disturbed as I was when I was watching some of those scenes in Evil Dead.
Well, yeah, I mean, you mentioned the tree scene, so we might as well kind of talk about it because I think that's what makes this really a good eco horror movie. But I mean, first, it sets up the idea that, like you said, it is this group of young friends that's out in the wilderness and they're utterly unprepared. And usually that's established in most of these movies, right? Is it's always somebody who isn't ready for what they're going to encounter in one way or another. They're like people who never step foot in the forest, or you know, people who aren't prepared to like rough it or whatever. But in this particular film, you know, you have these kind of naive kids going out there, and of course they find much more than just your typical, you know, creatures out in the woods. And in this case, they awaken and animate spirits that are, as you said, kind of zombifying people. And I think if it had been kept to just the scenes that happen at the cabin itself, even though there are some gross out moments, and this is partly based on the like claymation style that the ending, like you said, really goes into. It is played as both kind of gory but tongue in cheek too, especially when the girlfriend's head is coming up from the basement floor. You know, where she keeps kind of pushing up the trap door. Like, I mean, that is it's creepy, but it is played funny. But the addition of the stuff, I think, particularly outside of the cabin, is what has the darkest tones to it. So when you see those like fast tracking shots of like where it looks like not just somebody is watching them from outside, but somebody is like running towards them, which is terrifying, because I don't know, the way he shot it, it's like, yeah, again, it's not like even a voyeuristic type of shot, although that is there. It's like something is hell bent on getting them, when the camera just moves really fast towards the cabin, which is scary. But then there's the actual tree scene, which, you know, you have a tree, which is one of those things that generally people are not afraid of trees, right? Like that is something that is supposed to be fairly innocuous. Like if you're scared of something in the wilderness, it's going to be the thing that's hiding in the trees, like not the tree itself. And now because there's been this spirit awakened, it can animate it and physically violate the human body. And that, I think, adds the bleakness to the film, that kind of dark tone that actually the remake really plays up really well. I mean, I'm one of these people. I liked the remake, not as much as I liked the first, because the first just has a place in my heart, but I really enjoyed it. And it plays that up. But I just think that that's interesting that the stuff in the cabin, at least for me, is a little bit lighter and a little bit played for more fun than the stuff that happens outside of the cabin.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to look at it. I think that I think it maybe makes it scarier for an audience, because if you think, I don't know how to articulate this properly, but it's very easy to be like, well, they shouldn't have picked up the book and they shouldn't have played the tape of the person reading the incantation. So maybe you can blame them, but there is the implication, because of all the kind of haunted house type stuff that's going on at the beginning, that they were probably doomed whether they did that or not. And a lot of the creepy things that were happening at the beginning, like the bridge being messed up or the swing moving or doors moving, are already things that are external to a certain extent. They're like the shell of the building or in the cellar, or these, you know, if you're reading a haunted house book, you know that these sorts of places or these sorts of things are going to happen. But I think you're right. I mean, the darkest, creepiest, or weirdest, or scary, like in the cabin, there was gross out, obviously, for me, and kind of shock value to kind of surprise you. But the tree rape is intense. I particularly, I mean, if you're a woman watching it, you know, it's intense. You're thinking about the being bound and forcibly assaulted. But the trees attack the guy too and stab him. Scott. And so this idea of, it adds to the idea, I think, of menace and isolation, because they're not safe inside the cabin and they're not safe outside the cabin. And it's kind of as if they don't just have to worry about demons, but they also have to worry about nature literally turning against them. It's not like we talked last week when, you know, you get lost in the woods and you hurt yourself or something. This is, and it's not even like you're in a Flannery O'Connor story and you're in the woods and someone bad happens to be there and you went the wrong place at the wrong time. It's that something is making the woods be so evil that it's not like you're isolated and that you're far away from everything. It's that you're isolated and that the trees will literally hurt you. And I think it's too like the trees are almost playing with the people too, which I think makes it even it's physically and psychologically terrifying because it turns a lot of stuff that we think of on its head. Um, and yeah, I could see that because the stuff that happens in the cabin is bad enough, but it's a little bit like yeah, the popping up head and those sorts of things. But outside the cabin is like there's a real threat. You know, in that scene when the bridge has been destroyed and the woman realizes that they're all alone and she just kind of loses it. Like you really feel that you feel that isolation, I think, in a way that some movies claim that people are isolated, but you're kind of like, well, they could figure out a way out. But if nature itself is against you, then you really can't.
Well, and I think that kind of really drills down into that what makes eco horror so terrifying. And I'll go ahead and admit we probably should have said something about this in our first episode, that I think eco horror or eco gothic, they're really slippery terms, and I've seen people use them in all sorts of different ways. But I think what you're describing there really kind of gets to the essence of it for me, because if this was just like a haunted cabin story, then all they have to do is get outside the cabin and get away, right? Or like you said, if it's like a killer in the woods, like you're in a Flannery O'Connor story, and you've happened to run into the misfit when you shouldn't have because you took a wrong turn, then all you have to do is get away from that person, right? So if it's a killer chasing you, you've just got to hide well enough or like outrun that person. Or if it's a haunted house or a haunted cabin in this case, you just have to leave. But most of these, actually looking at our list of things we're going to talk about today, most of these movies are it's an ecosystem, for lack of a better word, that is haunted and or dangerous. So it makes it so there really is no escape. And again, that's kind of the terror of it, is like you said, when nature turns against you, what do you have? Because in this case, they can't go into the cabin for safety, even though that's what they try to do, but safety's not there. And then when they realize the horrors in the cabin and they try to run outside, well, guess what? It's just as bad. It's not offering any solace for you there either. And yeah, I mean, I think that kind of really nails down what we were talking about. I don't want to move on from Evil Dead too much, but Mel, I know you did watch Godzilla too, and I feel like this is a really good point to kind of segue into that, because those movies, where you have the kind of, I mean, we call them creature features, which is absolutely what they are, but especially in the first one, and I'm talking about the 1954 one, not the one where the American got added in. But that when you look at it, that fits. I think it's a more real world example, because you're not dealing with young naive college students who accidentally read from the Book of the Dead. But in this case, it is a much more realistic one, but it presents a world where the environment has literally turned against you. And in this case, it's because of something man did. It was man-made, but that still caused nature to turn in against them.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned this before on this podcast, but I'm a big Godzilla fan. My mother was a big Godzilla fan, and so I would watch the movies with her. And I texted Lisa about this yesterday. That's why she mentioned the thing about the American. But when I was a kid, I just saw the American version of the original Godzilla a few times, which added in different characters, and there's a little bit of editing. So I've only seen the original Japanese version, I think, a couple times, and one of which was last night because it'd been a while since I'd seen it, and I knew we were going to be talking about this sort of thing for this series. So I wanted to kind of refresh my memory. But watching it while thinking about eco horror, kind of added a little bit, I think, to seeing it this time, because it just, I mean, obviously eco horror is, you could probably argue, has been around a while. I mean, I think when we talked about Wyndham's The Day of the Triffids, I think we might have mentioned eco horror then. So it's not like this just happened, this idea of nature being dangerous or scary, or The Bird, is from the 1960s. Um, but Godzilla was kind of interesting to me watching again because of the way it's tied, of course, to the bombings, the atomic bomb. In fact, characters even, mention Nagasaki. They're like, well, I'm not going to evacuate this time because, I just barely escaped Nagasaki and I found a place to live and I don't want to leave now when Godzilla is coming. And there's a lot of kind of parallels when he's destroying the town because he irradiates people. Um, and it's straight up like the scientists say toward the beginning of the movie when they discover him and what he's doing, that when the ecosystem basically has been out of balance in the past, he comes, and if he doesn't have enough to eat or something is going on, he'll then begin to eat humans or attack them. And they discover that he has been living at the bottom of the ocean, apparently, is their reasoning. And when H-bomb tests happen, when hydrogen bomb tests happen, they kind of jar him, make him angry. They irradiate him, and he comes with a fury and begins attacking Japan and laying waste to Japan, and also irradiating everything around him because he carries the radiation. So yeah, I mean, they talk a lot in the movie, obviously, about these arms race that's going on, getting a bigger and better bomb, basically, and working toward a nuclear bomb, and the world is going to be destroyed. And then you have this creature that's supposedly from the past that's kind of like the Earth, I guess, coming back in vengeance. And of course, spoiler, at the end of the movie, they kill him by using the oxygen destroyer. And that even becomes a big thing because they've got to kill everything alive in the ocean that they rely on for their fishing industry to get rid of Godzilla. And there's a long, long debate as to whether it's even a good thing to have the oxygen destroyer or use it, because it could become a new weapon that could destroy the Earth and humanity. So if you watch that, I think it's like, oh, it's a Godzilla movie. Of course, the first one is much more serious movie than all the ones that followed. But there's definitely that eco horror idea. And if folks are watching the new Godzilla movies, just in the last one, Godzilla King of the Monsters, an eco terrorist who has really bizarre motivations that don't make a lot of sense, but you're paying to watch the monsters fight with each other, so it's okay. But wants to unleash the monsters to get rid of humanity because we destroyed the Earth, and the monsters will make everything go back to when everything was balanced. And so, even the kind of schlocky Godzilla films, I think, have this idea of we screwed up nature, we affected it somehow and it's coming back to get us. And I mean, a lot of creature features kind of do that because, there's a lot of creature features, like, what was it, Empire of the Ants, I think is called, where ants become irradiated and they get to be huge and they start killing people. And the moral of the story is not to, to get rid of your radiated waste better so that insects don't get irradiated and get so huge and kill people. But this idea of what are we doing to the Earth and how could this have negative consequences? It just those negative consequences and the things that we're doing to the Earth change with every generation when they make the movie. But it still is about that kind of balance that you were talking about, Lisa.
Well, and I was even going to say, we include Godzilla here as kind of the main example, but I'm glad that you mentioned some of the other creature features, because I think there's a lot of the creature features from the 50s that deal with that nuclear horror, but not just of fear of nuclear war, but fear of the possible side effects on the planet of nuclear radiation. I think there's a lot of things that movies that deal with that what will this do to the ecosystem is kind of the underlying message or moral, because the radiation makes ants 50 feet tall or whatever, what have you. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's something I'd kind of wanted to mention too, because I think that's kind of, it may not be at the heart of all Godzilla movies, but definitely at the beginning.
Oh yeah, yeah, and a lot of that you're totally. I mean, a lot of the creature features of the 50s and the 60s were about that too. Like, what does Fallout do? Um, and it's entertainment, but I think it's also kind of seriously looking at like, well, if you have all this radiation from all these testings all over the earth, then what could that possibly do to people? Um, yeah, maybe it's going to turn nature against us. It either will get pissed off and turn against us, or it'll be changed in some way. Well, guys, I'm sure that all three of us could probably keep talking about Godzilla and irradiated monsters because I know we like those kind of movies. And I think we've talked about a few of them in the past. But this idea of nature getting pissed off or angry or being vengeful for some reason reminds me of at least one, possibly a couple other movies we have on this list for today, and that's The Birds. Which is a movie that I actually rewatched earlier this year. I used to use it in a class I taught on supernatural and weird horror. I don't There's not really any radiation explanation for why the birds get angry. It's kind of like, I guess that's, I like to think of it almost as weird horror because it's like nature doing things that we can't quite explain. Which is, that scene that I absolutely love with the older woman who's a bird expert trying to explain how birds actually act scientifically, and then they totally do do a bunch of stuff that she was not expecting because that's the point of it. The horror is that we don't know why the birds are doing it. Um, but I know Lisa, I know you have thoughts about the birds because we've discussed this movie before. How do you think of it when you think of eco horror?
Um, yeah, I mean, I feel like it is certainly one of the earliest ones that we have besides maybe like Godzilla of where it is a true eco horror. And I think it fits because we have nature, even though we don't know the reason why the birds have suddenly shifted, like why they've suddenly turned. I think in the short story, the original short story, it maybe hints at something more.
And it hints at climate
Um,
change. Yeah.
yeah, it
Mhm.
does, but the movie itself doesn't. Not as much, I don't think. But you get the sense because the birds are so aggressive towards humans, like so aggressive that, I mean, you can feel the anger there, right? That it's a calculated attack. So it's not just, oh, we wandered into the wilderness. Like, okay, one movie that I'm sure we'll talk about is Jaws, right? Which I think gets lumped into eco horror. And I'm not really sure how I feel about that because to me, even though the movie Jaws got a lot wrong about how sharks actually behave, right? Which we've talked about Jaws in depth, so there's no need to really go into it. We did a whole episode on it a couple of summers ago. Um, but to me, that shows humans entering into an animal's territory, and then the animal is just behaving like an animal would behave, and that means sometimes that people get hurt or killed. Again, I know Jaws did not portray sharks accurately, so but in the movie logic, that's how it works, right? And so a wilderness movie where you have people like wandering into or getting lost into like a mountainous region and encountering a bear, that's terrifying. But that's very different from what we get in the birds, where birds are not behaving normally. They've changed their behavior and they've gone on the attack. So to me, that does really kind of fit into what we're talking about. It also, now that I think about it, fits in with what we were saying about really there being no escape. Because that's one thing both the short story and the movie does really well, is it shows people running from the birds. And eventually there are places or early on, there are places to hide, right? Because you just have to kind of run inside, shut the door, shut the windows. But by the end, when they're all kind of in the house together, you really get the sense that these birds are so aggressive and they're so relentless that eventually they're going to get into wherever you are, which that puts it into the category of something like the Evil Dead, right? Even though you're dealing with a different type of monster, nature is the same in both those movies because there's no safe place. Indoors, outdoors, you get the sense that, okay, you could leave this, you could leave the town they're in, but you're already hearing reports of other places. So there is kind of this worldwide sense of eventually there's going to be no place to hide. And I think that fits really well. I also like holding to that DeMaillet story of this happened because of climate change. Like birds were basically just like, okay, humans, you got to go. You're destroying our home. So we're taking it upon ourselves to like keep our, it's a safety mechanism for them, right? We're protecting our family and our home by getting rid of the predators, which are us. So yeah, in that way, I think The Birds does fit in really well to this kind of eco horror, and like the Godzilla movies or those, like Matt said, the other kind of nuclear creature featured movies that were popular in the 50s. I think it kind of sets a precedent for what we see later on with as eco horror kind of grows and changes over time.
No, I completely agree with you. I mean, it takes something like birds, which, I know there's some people are afraid of birds, and I don't like it if birds try to dive bomb me, but it takes them, it's like, there are a ton of birds out there, and if they all were hungry and they all were mad or they all were confused or they were all working together, you can't go outside and run away because they could fly and attack you. And like you said, you can't go in your house and shut the door because they can just come in wave after wave after wave until they break in and get you. And I think it also plays with the idea of the line between nature and what we call civilization. I'm doing air quotes, but we are encroaching on animals' worlds. And I think in a way, the birds is kind of like, well, this is what you've done to nature and you're encroaching on them. So now they're encroaching, back on you. And while you were talking, Lisa, I know this isn't on our list of things to talk about, but this idea of climate change being in a short story from the very early 60s reminded me of, John Wyndham's book, The Kraken Wakes, or Kraken, however you want to pronounce it, The Kraken Wakes from 1950s. I guess it would have been like early 50s. And we talked about Day of the Triffids on the podcast a few summers ago with the guys from Pseudopod. And I'm a big John Wyndham fan. But the Kraken Wakes is also kind of an eco horror, and it's the 50s, and it's also kind of a climate change because, again, you have atomic weapons being used and tested. It's messing up stuff in the ocean, and it turns out there's this creature under the ocean that also evolved to have intelligence like us. And they would like to come up on the land because they're mad that we're testing crap in the waters that's hurting them and irradiating them. And they also now don't have a really great place to live. And so you have this war kind of between us and them. And the environment ends up getting totally screwed up because the world powers start using these nuclear weapons to try to kill those people, which ends up hastening the glaciers melting, and there's flooding and everybody's trying to get to the highest spot and blah, blah, blah. And when I was reading that book a few years ago, I'm thinking to myself, well, this is the 50s and he's gaming out exactly what we're still talking about in 2020. And I think in some ways DeMaillet was kind of doing that too with the birds, even though that got lost a little bit. Because she talks about how with the temperature changes, the birds don't migrate properly and then they don't eat enough and they're confused and don't know what's going on. And that was lost in the Hitchcock version, I think. But it's very much eco horror.
Yeah. Eco horror, I'm noticing, is kind of a gateway into apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic literature, which we talked about. Because when you start talking about the just like humans' destruction of the environment, because when you look at something like the birds, right, you can see how really the only hope is that they can survive, but then what are they surviving for? Because the world's going to be changed as they know it. It's going to be kind of a day of the Triffids situation, right? Where maybe they figure out how to kind of form these communities where they can drink tea inside houses. But but it is an apocalypse of kind of, and when I think about like climate changes, I mean, we watched some on our summer of disaster movies, but they tend to be like that, or even movies like Snowpiercer, which isn't exactly eco horror because that's not, I don't think, the focus of it. It's more of like a sci-fi thriller that's class oriented, but it is eco horror, and that is what they're in, this like post-apocalyptic, post ice age landscape, and that's where that's going. Yeah, that's really funny how those kind of interact. They don't always have to, but sometimes they do, especially when you're dealing with eco horror, that the horror was brought about because of man did something. We polluted the earth so badly, we contributed to climate change so badly that now nature has no recourse but to attack. It's like a last ditch effort. I don't know, this one is not on our list either, and I'm really throwing us a curveball here, but it popped into my head, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts. We started this off talking about Evil Dead, and we talked about how that kind of franchise takes a turn into comedy. And you wouldn't think that eco horror and comedy would go like very well together. But then what do you do with something like The Toxic Avenger? Because wouldn't that technically be a type of eco horror?
I mean, I think it would fit. I mean, especially if we're going with eco horror as encompassing things like radioactive waste and and man's effects on the environment through things like pollution. Yeah, that strangely does kind of fit.
I mean, like I said, it's taking a sharp, turn from something like the original Godzilla, which was such like a serious piece on like, what people can do to each other and what war can do to a country, and these wounds, these like cultural and wounds after a war. And then, I mean, this is a trauma film, so it's very different, but it weirdly fits in the same timeline.
I mean, it does feel like it's stretching a little bit, I'm not going to lie, but I can definitely see that you could make a case for it. You can make a compelling argument that the Toxic Avenger fits here.
I'm just throwing it out there. Like you said, it popped into my head. I felt like it might fit a little bit. Just the looking at, because I'm always interested, and the reason I brought that up is because that, I think the first one came out in the 80s, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, that was not too far from when it was right around the same time that Bruce Campbell and they were all making the Evil Dead movies, which did have kind of that more humorous tone. It's just funny to me when we're looking at movies from like the 50s and 60s and they seem to be taking it so seriously. Like you said, even The Birds is a pretty serious film, even though they try to like jam a romance in there. And the story itself that it's based on is very serious. Godzilla, again, a serious film. and how it can kind of take that same theme, but then by the time you move forward a few decades and suddenly it's like, oh no, we can have fun with this. Like we can really just go all out and kind of mash a whole lot of comedy into this. And then I feel like we're kind of swinging the pendulum back to dealing with more serious films now that are eco horror when we're talking about today. Like I don't know what that says about our culture. It's just I see that pendulum swing coming back.
I can see that. And I think we also are seeing some, if in particular, I think this is a good theme to segue from our summer disaster, because several of our summer disaster movies could be considered eco horror. And the ones that were usually had someone like a scientist knowing that we were messing up the environment somehow, are going to face something terrible. And then, now it's darker, right? It's like this kind of like post 2001 view where something in the government or bureaucracy or corporation is trying to stop us from making the changes needed that the scientist says we need. And then they accelerate those consequences really quickly to give us a disaster film that ultimately becomes apocalyptic, whether people survive and have to change or not. I think you're right. I think there is a shift in the pendulum to, it seems like more and more scientists or people trying to warn us about things, and we don't make the changes, and then look what happens. And when we did our apocalypse series, I remember us talking about a few apocalypse books that involved disease and various things and people surviving in a new world that was much more nature oriented, and thinking about how people didn't necessarily pay attention to the signs, and that's what happened. And I don't know, I wonder if maybe we're coming more face to face in really stark ways with the things that have happened to the environment now in a way that we hadn't previously. I don't know. And you were talking about like 1980s pollution stuff. I don't know why, but Captain Planet just like popped into my head. Now that song is probably gonna be stuck in my head for a day or something. But yeah, there was this kind of like playful view with it, whether it was like a horror comedy or like these cartoons that were coming out for kids about pollution. Now we're kind of like, oh man, we got to do some changing, or there's going to be an apocalypse maybe. So I think that might be another connection back to our disaster films, this darker side that you're pointing out.
Well, I want to
Well,
bring up a film. Oh, sorry, Matt, go ahead.
well, I was going to, before we transition too far away from Toxic Avenger, I was also just going to throw out and ask if either of you were familiar with Swamp Thing, the comic and movies and whatnot.
A very
A
little
little
bit.
bit.
Yeah, not much.
Just very little. Okay. Well,
I mean, I feel like I remember watching one of the movies and maybe seeing a comic book, but that's about it.
well, the original was very pulpy and very 70s, but Alan Moore did a run on Swamp Thing in the 80s. It was I can't remember if it was before or after V for Vendetta, but it was definitely before he did Watchmen. And it was kind of a very interesting take on kind of the overlap of humanity and the environment, because here you have this man-plant hybrid thing, and it really kind of tackles those ideas of, I guess you could call it like anthropocentrism, of viewing humanity as the center of everything versus as part of an ecological system. I don't know, I just felt like a good place to mention it since you had already mentioned the Toxic Avenger. So I was just going to throw that out there.
I'm gonna have to go and check that out now, because I remember now somebody telling me that Alan Moore had done that, and I'm always a big fan of his stuff. So
Yeah, pretty much anything he
I'm gonna go
touches
look it
is
up.
amazing. So it's
Oh
definitely
yeah.
worth the read. It's been a long time since I've read his run on Swamp Thing, but it is really good. So anyway,
No,
what were you
I'm
about to say?
glad. I'm glad. I'm glad you brought it up, because it actually does go with what I was about to say. because one thing I've kind of noticed, and again, this is all things, I'm sorry, listeners, because I feel like sometimes I work through theories on our episodes and I don't know how they like come across. But I was looking at the tonal shifts that we've had over the decades. But now that I'm thinking about it too, I feel like we've shrunk down not the threat itself, but we had such big monsters in eco horror before. Like, I mean, we literally had Godzilla. We had, I mean, and the birds, even though birds themselves individually are not too terrifying, when you see them move in mass and you see the way they can coordinate their movements, I mean, it's something that's kind of breathtaking to behold, really. And when you imagine them coming at you in a big mass like that, then it becomes terrifying. So those are still kind of these big monsters. Even, like you said, Swamp Thing is, even though again we're shrinking, it's smaller than like Godzilla, you're still dealing with something very life size. I feel like now, even though the tone of our eco horror is very, very like stark and dark and serious, like I mentioned Snowpiercer, we mentioned some of the movies we watched, like The Day After Tomorrow, where the climate change threat is like very real, like it's here, it's happening very fast. But that's not really a monster you can see, right? Like we've kind of, as we've inflated the seriousness of it, we've kind of shrunk down the monster. And I mean, I'm thinking about this movie, The Bay, that I watched, and I really liked it. You guys didn't see The Bay, did you?
No, I haven't seen The Bay. You've told me about it, but I have not seen it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I also have not.
Well, this won't spoil too much because I think it's still an enjoyable movie, even, if you kind of know what's happening. It's like if you took Jaws and made it like a found footage movie, kind of. It's about this small town that's situated around a bay, as the name would suggest. And it might even be 4th of July weekend. If it's not, then it's like, I can't remember. It might be like first like opening summer weekend or it's for some reason everybody in the town is out celebrating and it's summertime and people are like very happy and oh, let's go to the parade and then let's go eat some ice cream and then let's go swim in the bay, and it's that kind of atmosphere. I think at one point you even have a mayor who, like the mayor in Jaws, ignores the threat that's happening and refuses to close down the water. But in this one, instead of there being a shark circling the water and taking down people, it is these like creatures in the water, but they're like microscopic. So it's a parasite that lives in the water that normally would be harmless, but because of, and it never really explains, although it gives several reasons why, the parasite is basically eating people alive. And you see this happening because really quickly, and the movie is about people trying, that's why I made the connection to Jaws, because it's more about people trying to stop it. What's happening, like in Jaws, there's a shark attack from the get-go. So kind of in this movie, there's something in the water that's hurting people, and it's about a certain group of people in the town that are documenting what's happening and trying to stop people from getting hurt. And I mean, I think it's a really good, I won't spoil the ending, I think it is a really good movie. But even now that I think about it, like that film, it's like a microscopic bug. It's something you can't see. It's more akin to like the way we would think of like a virus mutating, but in this case, it was caused most likely by polluted water. So it fits in that eco horror terror bit of it. But I don't know. I don't know why we're doing that. I don't know why we're taking it more seriously, but we're shrinking down the monsters.
It definitely seems a bit more realistic or maybe appropriate in a way. I mean, you could have a shark go up fresh water, right, and attack people in a place where they normally don't, but it's very difficult to have um like sharks are only going to work in certain settings, right? Like um but something like a bacteria or a parasite or something like that mutating because of something that we did, it's almost like more scary and more terrifying because that's something that could be near you in the bay near you or in a lake near you or in your drinking water or whatever. I mean, I feel like because it's microscopic, there's more of a fear of spread with that too. And it almost seems more of an equal opportunity killer because there's going to be ways that could get to you that say an animal creature couldn't as long as you're not in its habitat.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I wonder too if it doesn't kind of again speak to that seriousness that I think some of these films are trying to address because if it's a Swamp Thing or if it's a Godzilla, that seems too easy to be like, well, those things aren't real. Or um that is the only threat. So if you can get rid of that, then everything's okay, which again, from everything you said about the original Godzilla, we know that's not true. um and I wonder if some of these films where it is eco horror in that nature has become hostile, the fact that we can't see a monster, we can't pinpoint a monster, but it's still there, it's that threat still exists, might speak to the fact that people want you to understand that this is a real thing, like that it's like you were saying, Mel, that it could happen to a place where you live or a place near you. In fact, it is happening, it's already happening. And I mean, that's the way environmental pollution and climate change works, right? Like, you can't just identify, oh, well, climate change is a problem. If we just get rid of the giant lizard that's stomping around in the Arctic, it would be okay. That's not the way it happens. It's more of a systemic thing. And yeah, I mean, maybe that's the point of these kind of movies, where they can just kind of minimize, or they don't give you either they give you a microscopic threat, or the threat doesn't have, like, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not corporeal. It doesn't have a body. Something like M. Night Shyamalan's The Happening, where I guess the threat is the trees, but really it's something you can't see. It's something that the trees are putting out that you can't see. And so the monster doesn't have a body anymore, which makes it kind of that much more terrifying and that much harder to fight, because you're not fighting against, Swamp Thing anymore. You're not fighting against. Am I making sense, or am I rambling?
No, I think you're making a lot of sense. And I find myself thinking about our current moment in our real lives a lot too, because, and I think a lot of horror comes from that as well. The idea of contagion. It's something that you can't see that, is affected by the environment. I mean, even it's not just parasites and such, it's also pathogens. Um, and they can spread and they can affect a lot of people. And so you have the invisibility and you have the spread of it in a way that, like you're saying, you don't have um, with those other fears or those other monsters. Well, with that extremely terrifying and dark thought, listeners, this might be a good place to end our discussion of creatures in nature becoming mutated or angry in some way and attacking us. We hope you've enjoyed our discussion. We hope we talked about some of your favorite books and movies. As always, we would love to hear from you. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram, and we have a Facebook page. If you'd like to contact us by email, and we do enjoy getting emails and communications from y'all, please send us an email at nofearcast@gmail.com. If you have another movie you would like to add or talk about, or if you have something you want to add on one of these movies we have talked about in this episode, or just the idea of eco horror, please let us know. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon and get access to exclusive content. So these main episodes come out every other week, but in the weeks in between, as Lisa mentioned at the top of this episode, we have shorter mini episodes where we let our patrons who are paying $5 a month maybe get a heads up as to what our next theme is going to be, or get a little bit more information about something we've been talking about. So we have over 100 mini episodes that once you become a patron, you can check out and get a little bit of extra exclusive content. For instance, this past one, we talked about the haunted cabin, the real life haunted cabin story behind the cabin in Evil Dead. But with everything that's going on in the world right now in 2020, we totally understand if supporting us on Patreon is not something that you can do right now. But if you are enjoying the show and you'd like to help us out, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. It helps the Apple algorithm suggest us to folks who may be interested in podcasts like this one, and it's entirely free. And also there's word of mouth. So, if you know someone, friend or family that you think, is getting more into podcasts maybe during the pandemic, or, might be interested in this topic, give them a heads up about No Fear Cast, and help kind of spread the word about the podcast. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you so much for listening. And we'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode about eco horror.